You were never supposed to hear this name, St. Luthan Seminary. It was erased from maps, removed from church archives, and even the Vatican denies it ever existed. But in 1852, 12 priests vanished from its stone halls without a trace. No bodies, no witnesses, just silence. And the silence wasn't normal, it was thick, ritualistic, like something had been fed. To this day, the ground where it stood has never been resold. Surveyors who've gone there report headaches, nosebleeds, missing time. A federal archivist once tried to digitize records from a now-defunct diocese linked to the seminary. Within 48 hours, he was found dead in his apartment, jaw shattered, eyes removed, tongue nailed to a copy of the Codex Gigas. You see, this story isn't about haunted churches or Victorian superstitions. This is about infrastructure, dark infrastructure. An ecclesiastical mechanism engineered to rewrite reality through ritual and obedience. They called it a seminary, but it was never meant to train priests. It was built to create spiritual weapons men, stripped of ego and injected with ancient schema. Men taught not to serve God, but to harness the quiet dominion between confession and control. You've been taught to trust institutions like these. They wear white collars, offer absolution, speak in parables. But what you weren't taught, what they've kept from you, is that beneath every sacred vow lies a mirror world. And some mirrors don't reflect, they devour. There's a reason. You've never heard of St. Luthan's. There's a reason even most clergy fear whispering its name. Because what happened inside its chapel wasn't divine. It was ancient, pre-biblical, and it worked. For a brief moment in time, a ritual was completed that never should have been attempted. Not by priests, not by men. 12 entered the catacombs beneath the nave for a midnight consecration. They never returned. What came back wasn't human. This isn't folklore. The records existed until they were locked in a steel vault under the Archdiocese of Baltimore, protected by non-disclosure oaths and 3 separate papal decrees. Why? Because St. Luthan's wasn't the only one. It was the first. A prototype in a larger program, one that still echoes beneath the seminaries of today. You are about to learn what the world does to men who know too much. Welcome to the Shadow Seminary. And understand this, once you step through this door, you can never pretend you didn't hear it. The official church response was swift and surgical. Within 48 hours of the disappearances, St. Luthan's Seminary was declared a structural hazard. By the end of the week, every local newspaper that reported the story had retracted it. The editor of the Harrisburg Herald, who first broke the headline, was institutionalized before the month's end, diagnosed with a sudden, aggressive form of religious mania. He'd been found in his study, mumbling a single Latin phrase over and over, vox clamatis in tenebris, a voice crying out in the darkness. But there were whispers. Among the old clergy, the ones who survived the purge of 1853, fragments of truth were passed in confession booths, never on paper, never in light. A bishop in Lancaster reportedly kept a locked drawer filled with sketches, diagrams of strange tunnels beneath the seminary, etched with symbols not found in any Catholic rite. One symbol was repeated, an inverted keyhole inside a circle of thorns. When questioned by a Jesuit archivist years later, the bishop wept, then burned the entire drawer. What was St. Luthan's built on? That's the question no one wants to answer. The land was purchased in 1823 from a Quaker family who refused to speak of what they'd found in the soil. Records show they left Pennsylvania entirely after the sale, relocated to a coastal village in Maine known for shipwrecks and suicides. But before they vanished, the eldest son left a warning carved into the wooden beam of the barn. Do not teach the dead to speak. The church knew. They always knew. They sent not just priests, but linguists, mathematicians, and men trained in exorcism, though not under that name. One of the 12 who disappeared was Father Elias Morvant, a man who had been excommunicated. twice, and yet brought back each time under direct Vatican orders. His final sermon, delivered the night before the ritual, was described by attendees as not human in tone. Witnesses claimed his voice carried an echo, even in open air, and that every candle in the chapel extinguished itself the moment he said Amen. You still think this is just a story? Every major empire in history had a priesthood that served not faith, but power. And when the rituals of Rome decayed, the church became the vault hiding the tools of control in the robes of piety. St. Luthan's was an experiment in resurrection, not of the body, but of memory, of influence, of dominion. And they were willing to lose men to achieve it. There was one man who tried to expose it, Dr. Nathaniel Ward, a Protestant theologian and rogue antiquarian who gained limited access to Vatican-adjacent archives through blackmail and bribery. He published a private monograph in 1864 titled The Inversion of Grace, Unspoken Technologies of the Ecclesiastical Underground. Only 9 copies were printed. 7 were burned by papal order. 1 surfaced in a London occultist collection, and the final copy, heavily annotated in Ward's own blood, was found in a locked chest, buried beneath the foundation of a collapsed church in Vermont. Ward didn't die of natural causes. He vanished while lecturing at a Masonic lodge, mid-sentence, in full view of 27 men. No trace of him was ever found, not even his voice on the wax cylinder recording he insisted on using. The audio cuts out the moment he utters the phrase, reverse Eucharist. Just silence, then static. Then, for 3 full seconds, the unmistakable sound of 12 men whispering in unison, not in Latin, not in English, but in something older. Something before language. His writings described a theory that seminaries like St. Luthan's weren't just religious training grounds, but vector points constructed on ley lines, geomagnetic intersections, places where reality's veil thins. He called them theological conductors, meant to anchor metaphysical programs into the physical world. Think of it like software written in blood and obedience code that alters perception, belief, and eventually behavior. A mass ritual cloaked as education. But why priests? Because priests are obedience incarnate. They surrender will, identity, even family. They are ideal vessels for systems of control. If you can hollow out a man's internal compass and replace it with a ritual schema, he becomes a walking node and agent of influence that doesn't need orders, only pattern recognition. Imagine an entire generation of such men deployed into society, into schools, clinics, governments, carrying out protocols they don't even consciously understand. This was not religion. This was weaponized belief. Luthan's was the prototype. But it wasn't the only one. Evidence points to similar disappearances at St. Drogo's in Belgium, the White Church in southern Spain, and the infamous St. Norbert's cloister outside Vienna, where 13 monks were walled in alive under divine instruction. You were taught to look for power in crowns and currencies. But the real power is in thought, in the architecture of belief. And St. Luthan's, forgotten, buried, erased, was a keystone in that architecture. A dark altar where 12 men were offered, not to God, but to the system. You have to understand, when power moves in silence, it moves without resistance. That's why what happened at St. Luthan's was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to be repeated. Because the system doesn't just bury its failures. It refines them, adjusts the ritual, alters the liturgy, trains the next cohort with improved parameters. That's how control evolves. Not by brute force, but by recursive engineering of minds. Willing to obey. The real horror of St. Luthan's wasn't the disappearance of the 12. It was what happened in the months after. Parishioners in nearby towns began reporting strange behavior among clergy priests, preaching sermons that seemed off. Not in content, but in rhythm. Whole congregations leaving Mass in silence. No music, no laughter, no fellowship. Just empty. Eyes on folded hands, One witness, a deaf girl named Agnes Mulroney, began sketching the chapel every night in her sleep visions of a tower that didn't exist, etched with windows that looked inwards instead of out. Her family, deeply religious, thought it was divine inspiration. Until the drawings shifted black roots growing under the altar, priests with no mouths, a chalice filled with ash. Then Agnes disappeared, same as the 12, no forced entry. Just an open window and a crucifix cracked in half. The church sent investigators, not the public kind, the internal kind. Men who don't wear collars but answer directly to the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. One of them left behind a sealed journal recovered by a groundskeeper who later hung himself. In it, the final line reads, "They never meant to ascend, they meant to anchor." That's the key. You're told to believe the sacred is above. But the ones who run the system, they reach downward, into what ancient mystics called the hollow, a conceptual underworld, not of fire, but memory-layered strata of unresolved human thought, trauma, belief. By accessing it, they don't just control individuals. They control the field, the spiritual network behind perception itself. Priests were the interface. Est. Luthan's was built on a specific angle, aligned not with the stars, but with a structure beneath the earth older than any cathedral. That alignment allowed access, but access comes with a price. 12 were offered, yes, but in return, the system got something back. A key. Not to heaven, but to you. By 1854, just 2 years after the incident, something changed across the eastern seaboard. Subtle at first, quiet, but unmistakable for those who could see patterns. Enrollment in nearby seminaries spiked suddenly. Young men from well-off families began pledging themselves to the cloth with fervor, claiming visions, dreams, and irresistible callings. But none of them could remember who first told them to apply. Not one. It was as if the idea had planted itself directly in their minds. Now, look closer. 2 of those young men would go on to become bishops. One of them would found a psychiatric asylum known for pioneering silence-based therapy, a method involving weeks of complete sensory deprivation and Gregorian chant. Another would be linked to covert psychological experiments in a federal hospital in D.C., experiments that later fed into Way Ultra. All of them, traces of St. Luthan's in their bloodlines. All of them trained in altered liturgi. The question is no longer what happened at St. Luthan's. The question is, what was unleashed? Remember, there were no survivors, but there were echoes. Clergy from neighboring towns began to report waking up outside, feet covered in dirt, holding candles burned to the wick. One nun was found wandering the seminary ruins, eyes scratched. Out by her own hands, repeating the same phrase, they walked out through the 4th door. There is no 4th door in any standard church design, unless you count the ones buried underground. Architectural records, recovered from a Vatican courier's luggage seized by customs and buried in an obscure archive, revealed that St. Luthan's chapel was constructed around an unmarked vertical shaft, 40 feet down, sealed with a marble plug etched with 12 unknown sigils. This shaft was not on any official diagram. Its construction predates the seminary by nearly a century. And yet, the chapel was perfectly centered over it, like a lock fitted to a keyhole that had always been waiting. Understand this. Structures encode function. A cathedral channels awe. A prison channels obedience. St. Luthan's? It was designed to channel submission to the unseen. Every sermon, every hymn, every kneeling prayer was a ritual of integration. Not with God, but with something older. Something that needed belief to enter our world. And it succeeded. Because belief deep, unquestioning belief is the most powerful transmitter known to man. It doesn't just change what we see. It changes what can be seen. The door has already opened. What walks through that door doesn't need form. It doesn't need flesh. It needs only structure. That's what they learned at St. Luthan's, that once you create the right environment, an architecture of silence, obedience, and repetition, you don't summon a demon, you build one. Constructed not from bone, but from behavior. From thoughts, synchronized across time. From rituals repeated across generations. From men who never once questioned the source of the voice in their mind whispering, "Obey, kneel, preach." But someone did question. His name was Brother Calder Reinhardt. He was the groundskeeper's son, brought in as a novitiate by special exception. Not a priest, not a scholar, just a watcher. He saw what others ignored. The strange symbols that never washed off the chapel floor. The animal bones buried beneath. The altar. The hollow sound that came from the nave each morning before Mass like something inside. The walls was breathing. Reinhardt kept a journal. It was found years later in a false compartment beneath a statue of St. Bartholomew. It was filled with diagrams, rituals, and one repeated warning. The ritual is a loop. The disappearance is only the midpoint. He believed the 12 were not taken but processed. That the seminary was less a trap and more a gateway, a conversion mechanism. He described dreams he couldn't wake from, dreams in which the chapel inverted. The floor became the sky, the crucifix bled backward. The pews filled with figures wearing no faces, only mirrored masks. And at the center, an altar made of bone and ash, with a voice speaking from beneath it, never rising above a whisper. It told him, "This is the echo of the first command." And what was that first command? Be still. Stillness is the foundation of obedience, of passivity, of control. In that stillness, belief takes root. And once rooted, it can be used to grow anything. That's what they were cultivating. The Vatican labeled Reinhardt a heretic, claimed he fled into the mountains and froze to death. But no body was ever recovered. Only a single page nailed to the seminary's burnt door. They are making a God from silence. Think about that. A God that needs no miracles, no fire from heaven, no thunderous voice, only silence. And belief dot because silence is the perfect camouflage for domination. And belief? The perfect vessel for its spread dot by now. You're beginning to feel it that slow, creeping realization that what you thought was faith might have been design. That what you've called free will could, in fact, be programmed submission. But this goes deeper than doctrine. This is about engineering the soul. St. Luthan's wasn't a place of worship. It was a laboratory of control. A living experiment in the psycho-architecture of obedience. How to build a man who will follow any voice that sounds like God. And they succeeded because they understood a secret. That the human psyche isn't protected by walls. It's protected by patterns. And if you control the pattern of ritual, of repetition, of meaning itself, you control the man. That's what happened to the 12. They weren't just taken. They were emptied, dissolved into a system that could replicate itself. You see, 12 is a sacred number in nearly every theology for a reason. 12 apostles, 12 tribes, 12 signs. It's the number of cyclical authority of continuity, disguised as divinity. But at St. Luthan's, 12 became something else, a quorum. A minimum threshold of minds aligned to one schema, one ritual, one echo. After the ritual, reports surfaced of 12 other seminaries beginning to experience strange anomalies, blackouts during Mass, candles burning cold, spontaneous bleeding. From the eyes of novices during confession. Every seminary was connected, not through infrastructure, but intention. And that intention had been encoded. Theologians speak of the Logos, the divine word, the ordering principle of reality. But what if the Logos could be inverted? A counterword, designed not to reveal truth, but to embed control? Imagine a sermon, spoken in perfect cadence, structured to bypass logic, to implant instructions without awareness. That's what was written into the hymns at St. Luthan's. That's what the 12 learned to speak. And now we come to the most dangerous truth. Some of them returned, not as men, not in body, but in thought, in influence, in the reshaping of institutions that followed. Within 50 years, the very structure of seminary training changed across Europe and North America. Less mysticism, more obedience, less exploration, more hierarchy, less questioning, more silence. They didn't disappear. They spread. This is your last chance to turn back. But if you're still here, then you were meant to hear this. And I'm going to ask you something important in just a few minutes to mark yourself, symbolically, so I know you're awake. But not yet. First, you must understand how deep this control goes. They call it the Great Stillness. A doctrine buried beneath centuries of theological misdirection, hidden not in heresy, but in canon. A metaphysical principle that says, true power doesn't scream, it waits. The more still a force becomes, the more influence it exerts. And St. Luthan's was built to house something perfectly still, something that had waited for centuries not to be worshipped, but activated. You see, most men think the danger lies in noise, in violence, rebellion, upheaval. But that's a lie. The true machinery of domination hums in silence, in rules obeyed without question, in prayers repeated without meaning, in empty rituals that fill the space where thought once lived. Every Sunday, millions repeat creeds they never wrote. They kneel on cue, they bow their heads, and they never ask, what is this rhythm tuning me to? At St. Luthan's, the rhythm was engineered. There was a metronome embedded in the chapel walls, disguised as ventilation ticks, a pulse, 33 beats per minute, matched to the resting heart rate of a dying man. Why? Because this wasn't about worship, it was about entrainment, making the body sync with an ancient template, one designed not for salvation, but submission. The 12 priests were chosen because they showed signs of absolute yield, complete psychological vulnerability cloaked as devotion. They were perfect conduits for the inversion process. Their final retreat involved 7 days of fasting, silence, and mirror gazing. On the 8th day, each one reported seeing the man with no face standing behind them in the glass. Not a hallucination, a presence. The same figure later drawn independently by 3 Vatican-trained exorcists during unrelated cases in Poland, Argentina, and northern India. The Church doesn't call it a demon, they call it the echo. Because that's how it moves through soundless repetition, through tradition, through obedience disguised as faith. Luthan's was merely the speaker. The echo needed a place to speak through. And now it speaks through liturgies, through institutions, through empty words repeated until they form new architecture in the human soul. And if you're still watching, still breathing, I need you to prove to the algorithm and to yourself that you're not just a listener, you're a witness. Type this phrase into the comments twice. I walked through the 4th door. Say it once for memory. Say it again for identity. And now that you've marked yourself, good, you've crossed the threshold now. You've taken the first real action a man can take in a world built to make him kneel. You've witnessed. And once you've seen the mechanism behind the veil, you can never unsee it. This is the point of no return. The point where the ritual turns from history into programming. Because the story of St. Luthan's isn't frozen in 1852. It's alive, it's replicating. And if you look close enough, you'll see its fingerprints in your own life. Ask yourself, where did your first ideas about right and wrong come from? Who taught you what sin meant? Why silence is considered sacred? Why stillness is seen as holy? These weren't just lessons. They were codes, lines of belief written into your consciousness before you ever had a chance to reject them. And where do all those codes trace back to? Institutions, systems, clergy, schools, and before all of them, Seminaries. What is a seminary really? It's not just a school. It's a forge. A place where men are melted down and recast into shapes that no longer belong to themselves. You think they're teaching theology? They're teaching patterned response, conditioning, rhythm of voice, use of eye contact, emotional tempo calibrated for maximum influence. Strip away the iconography, and what you have is a behavioral programming chamber disguised as sacred ground. St. Luthan simply took it to its logical extreme. By using sacred geometry, they aligned the chapel with geomantic fault lines locations, where magnetic interference subtly rewires neurological response. Every kneel, every bowed head, every Latin syllable spoken under vaulted stone was part of an invocation, not upward toward God, but downward into the well of collective memory, into the dark archive, into the hollow realm where echo waits to enter. 12 men were not enough to contain it, but 12 men were enough to seat it. The proof? Since 1852, global theology has shifted. More rigidity, more hierarchy, more silence, less mysticism, more obedience. Even Protestant sects began mimicking Roman structure. Coincidence? Or did the echo find new channels? This is why you've always felt something off when entering sacred spaces. That tickle at the base of your spine, that subtle tightening in your chest. You weren't feeling awe. You were feeling alignment. Your body adjusting to frequencies you were never meant to carry. And the worst part? They were installed before you could speak. Do you want to see what's coming next? You were trained to think of evil as chaos, violence, screaming shadows in alleyways. But true evil, true control, it's quiet. It wears robes, it smiles. It says, "Peace be with you," as it rewrites the code of your will. And that's why St. Luthan's mattered. It proved that you don't have to conquer a man's body to own him. You only have to own his sense of the sacred, because once the sacred is corrupted, everything else falls in line. This is what most men never realize. You can resist laws, question governments, rebel against leaders, but very few ever dare to question the rituals, the prayers they recite, the blessings they seek, the architecture that dictates where they sit, when they speak, how they bow. And when a ritual is constructed by power, not by truth, it becomes a weapon that no one sees. Now listen carefully. After the disappearances at St. Luthan's, there was one more anomaly barely reported, buried in a footnote of an obscure diocesan ledger. A traveling exorcist named Father Dorian Venn stopped at the seminary ruins on his way to Boston. He stayed one night, and by morning he had clawed a message into the frozen ground with his fingernails. It is not a demon, it is a design. Those 6 words were all he left behind before walking barefoot into the woods. Never found. Never heard from again. It's that line that changes everything. Because if it wasn't a demon, if it was a design, then the horror of St. Luthan's wasn't spiritual. It was intentional. A human-created system, built with sacred symbols. Yes, but weaponized for psychological transformation. A machine made of ritual, silence, obedience, and the annihilation of self. That same pattern now hides in every institution that asks you to submit without understanding, in every hierarchy that demands belief before knowledge, in every ceremony that tells you stillness is salvation. You think this story is about priests? No doubt this story is about you, because somewhere in your life, you've felt it, that subtle pressure to agree, to kneel, to conform. That moment where you were told, directly or indirectly, to sacrifice your inner voice on the altar of tradition. You were told it was holy, but what if that altar is the same one built at St. Luthan's? And what if you are next in line? Do you know why they erase these stories? Why St. Luthan's is not in textbooks? Why no seminary bears its name? Why even whispers about it draw silence from men who wear the cloth? Because it worked, and what works for power must be buried. Not because it failed, but because it was too effective. St. Luthan's was a success. The disappearances were not a tragedy. They were a transition, a pivot point, a calibration in the machinery of control. And that machine made of myth, memory, and mirror still spins. We have records, partial, redacted, retrieved at great cost, suggesting that after the Luthan ritual, Vatican doctrine began to subtly shift. Prayers shortened. Emphasis moved away from personal revelation toward intercession, always through the institution. Authority no longer flowed from God to man. It flowed from God to church, to hierarchy, to doctrine. And then to you, power distanced itself. This is no accident. It's ritual-based stratification. A system of delayed access that keeps divinity always just out of reach while drawing obedience ever closer. You do not speak to God. You speak to the interface, the agent, the echo. And that echo? It multiplies. From St. Luthan's, a web spread. Theological institutes began replicating its architectural blueprints under different names. Gothic revival, they called it. Neo-Romanesque. But the ratios were exact. 3:5 nave to apse curvature, 8-degree alignment to magnetic. North, bell towers tuned to 432 Hz, the frequency of emotional entrainment. Men don't just worship in these buildings. They sync with them. Every gesture becomes a form of consent. But here's what they never tell you: ritual isn't neutral. It doesn't just affirm. It binds, and when repeated inside geometry designed to override will, ritual becomes contract. Ask yourself, what exactly did you agree to when you took communion? When you were confirmed? When you were baptized as a baby, voiceless, held over a basin carved with sigils you could not see? St. Luthan's taught the system one thing above all: if you can anchor belief before language, you never need to argue again. The man will follow, the man will obey, because the man will have no language left with which to resist. And you think it's just the church? No. That was just the beginning. Do you want to see where the pattern really leads? Let me be absolutely clear now. St. Luthan's was not an isolated ritual. It was a prototype deployment in a much older campaign, the war for human attention. And they won, not with armies, not with swords, but with sacred architecture, silence, repetition, and guilt. Guilt, the oldest leash. Shame, the invisible cage. Because if they can convince a man that his very thoughts make him unworthy, then he will never trust his own instincts again. He will crawl to the priest. He will beg for cleansing. He will kneel forever, and yet most never realize the cage was built before their bones hardened. Let me show you the system beneath the system. In 1855, 3 years after the Luthan disappearance, a Jesuit scholar named Ambrose Duval was reassigned from Rome to North America without cause. But in his confiscated journals, now sealed in a private collection in Prague, he wrote that he was sent to reinforce the conduits. That's the word he used: conduits. Not congregations, not cathedrals, conduits, places of transmission. And not of grace, as he clarified, of compliance. Duval observed that every seminary built after St. Luthan's followed the same blueprint. Identical floor plans, identical sequences of vows, identical postures at the moment of total surrender. He came to believe the Church had developed not just a theology, but a program, a repeatable protocol to erase selfhood and replace it with theological code. A soul overwritten in ritual syntax. But here's the darker truth. It spread from the church to state institutions, from pulpits to podiums, from seminaries to schools. Public education adopted the same principles, the same rows, the same bells, the same silent obedience. Sit down, face forward, memorize, repeat, pass the test. Never ask who wrote it. The same liturgy, just without robes. St. Luthan's didn't vanish. It scaled. They learned how to turn belief into infrastructure, into scaffolding for the soul. Once a man's inner architecture is installed, you no longer have to control him. He will control himself, censor his thoughts, deny his instincts, punish his rebellion, all for the illusion of being good. And now look at yourself. How many times have you betrayed your own intuition just to remain accepted? How many truths have you buried in silence just to keep peace? That's not peace. That's programming. The same programming born beneath that cursed seminary in 1852. If you're ready to confront the next layer, the system that now uses technology to continue what the church began, now the veil begins to burn, because everything you've heard so far, St. Luthan's, the 12 priests, the architecture of belief, it was only the first iteration. A primitive operating system for what has now evolved into a global infrastructure. You think the ritual stayed in churches? No, it adapted. It digitized. The cathedrals have become platforms. The sermons, algorithms. And the fourth door, the one whispered by the nun with no eyes, is now in your pocket. That's the secret no one wants to speak aloud. The ritual moved into tech. You think your phone is a tool? It's a chalice, a sacred object, worshipped hourly, held with both hands, consulted in silence, looked at before sleep, looked at upon waking. Prayers no longer whispered to saints, but typed into search bars. Confessions no longer given to priests, but poured into status updates. And behind it, all a machine learning every part of you, every fear, every hunger, every weakness. This is the new seminary. The screen is the altar. The scroll is the liturgy. The feed is the catechism. And the architects? They learned from St. Luthan's. They understood that to control a man, you must first narrow his attention. Frame the ritual. Make obedience effortless. They built the interfaces to be invisible cages. No brick, no blood. Just color schemes, dopamine loops, and endless echoes. The echo didn't die with the 12. It went wireless, because belief is no longer needed to control you. Now, all they need is your attention. That's the currency. That's the offering. Every second you give to a system that doesn't serve you, that's a tithe. A sacrifice of potential. A surrender of will. And it's everywhere. Silent updates. Behavioral nudges. The slow eradication of solitude. You are never alone anymore. Not because the world is connected, but because something is always listening. Hesti. Luthan's was about building a vessel. Your generation? You are the vessel. And unless you take conscious action, unless you reclaim the sacred from the synthetic, you will be nothing more than another priest in a digital church you didn't know you joined. The ritual has no mercy. It doesn't care what you believe. It only cares that you repeat. And you will unless you choose now to awaken. Ves seen the blueprint. Do you want to see who authored it? Who authored the blueprint? Not a single man. Not a single order. Not even the church, in its visible form. What built St. Luthan's, and what now builds the invisible cathedrals of control all around you, is a lineage, a priesthood of systems, custodians of pattern, architects of the inner cage. They don't wear robes anymore. They wear suits, badges, and brands. But their allegiance is the same, to the hidden order behind obedience, to the preservation of submission as structure. These are not conspiracists in shadows. They are engineers in daylight. They sit on corporate boards, educational think tanks, media councils, algorithm design teams. They write white papers by day and chant inversion doctrines by night. They've learned the greatest trick of all that to hide a ritual in modern times. You digitize it. You make it normal, frictionless, desirable. You make the sacrament feel like convenience. Scroll, click, agree, obey. You think this is just metaphor? Look deeper into the original architectural plans of St. Luthan's, which surfaced in a defrocked monk's estate sale in Krakow. They show a labyrinth under the chapel, 13 turns, designed to disorient and invert perception. At its center, was not a crypt, but a mirror. That's where the 12 stood. That's where the voices came. And now, look around you. What is your screen, if not a mirror? It reflects not who you are, but who you're supposed to be. Who you've been told to become. It shows you filtered faces, manufactured gods, rituals of success, and digital priesthoods that sell you clarity, while feeding you confusion. But behind it all is the same structure. The altar is no longer stone. It is data. Your sacrifice is your time. Your prayers are your clicks. Your confession is your algorithmic footprint. And the high priests of this new seminary? They don't wear collars. They wear headsets. They smile in TED Talks. They promise liberation while constructing loops so deep, you mistake captivity for connection. They have read the sacred texts of control. They studied St. Luthan's not to mourn it, but to replicate it. They've built a new fourth door. But now, you don't walk through it. You tap, and the ritual completes itself. But what happens when a man wakes up inside the ritual? Waking up inside the ritual is not glorious. It's not cinematic. It doesn't come with thunder or light. It comes like a sickness, a shiver behind the eyes, a knowing you can't unknow. Suddenly you see the pattern in everything. The calendar becomes a metronome of submission. The workplace, a chapel of quiet resignation. The schoolroom, a liturgy of obedience. And in the stillness between each heartbeat, you finally understand. You were trained to kneel before you could stand. That's the legacy of St. Luthan's. Not the ritual, it's the template. The download, a formatting system for consciousness. And if you're feeling anger, fear, resistance right now, that's good. That means the old scaffolding is cracking. That means the fourth door didn't consume you. It opened you, but no. The system has defenses. It's not just passive architecture. It has guardians. Not men with guns, but systems of shame, of ridicule, of false truths spoken with enough repetition to become gospel. Speak against the cathedral and profess. You'll be mocked, not by priests, by peers, by friends, even family. That's the genius of modern obedience. The cage is enforced by the inmates. Why do you think the 12 disappeared? Because they were meant to vanish. Because the seminary didn't fail. It succeeded in creating the first generation of reverse carriers, men who didn't speak truth to the flock, but implanted design into their souls. We've traced the bloodlines. Subtle, but they exist. Through changes in names, migration patterns, hidden marriages, each of the 12 has a lineage. And their descendants? Many of them occupy positions of immense influence. Think tanks, foundations, political committees with theological roots. And all of them, whether knowingly or not, continue the ritual. Because here's the deepest cut. The ritual no longer requires awareness. It runs subconsciously. It's the cadence of control, the rhythm of surrender, a virus of belief wrapped in holiness. And it's infected more than faith. It's in your laws, your economy, your language, the very shape of your thought. You think you choose, but your choices were curated before you. Were born. You ask, who benefits? Not who. What. Because there's something on the other side of this control. Something that feeds on a dot, and if you're ready to see its silhouette, there's a reason no one speaks its name. Because names are locks, and what St. Luthan's uncovered in 1852 was a force older than any language spoken by man, a presence. That doesn't need worship in the traditional sense. It requires only order, hierarchy, submission. Every pyramid, spiritual or political, points to it. Every system of ranked obedience echoes it. The priests called it that which dwells beneath the rhythm, but it's not a demon. It's not a god. It is structure incarnate, not made of flesh. Made of protocol. It doesn't need to see you. It only needs your participation, your ritual, your repetition, your unthinking obedience to the sequence. And it was fed that obedience by 12 perfectly trained vessels. Men who disappeared because their flesh was no longer necessary. Their patterns remained. And that's all the dweller needs repeating. Patterns. You've seen it before. In the cold precision of bureaucracies that crush souls without intention. In the unyielding logic of policies that punish children and reward cruelty. In the way a corporation can smile while killing a town. That emptiness you feel when you realize no one at the top is actually human anymore. That's it. Not possessing bodies. Possessing systems. The dweller was not summoned, it was invited. Slowly, over centuries, through belief made mechanical. Through prayer turned into protocol. Through silence shaped into code.sd. Luthan's was the access point. The chapel's proportions were not just aesthetic, they were harmonic, aligned with something called the Saturn resonance. A frequency believed by pre-Christian mystics to bind linear time and contract soul energy. The 12 priests were arranged. Like the hands of a clock, their voices modulated, their bodies trained for months to act in absolute unison. They were not worshiping. They were programming. They weren't contacting heaven. They were building a throne, and now? The throne is no longer beneath a chapel. It's inside every institution that demands obedience without understanding. Inside every sacred system that punishes questioning. Inside every man who's told to serve an invisible order with no face, no voice, only rules. The dweller doesn't kill. It convinces you that you were never meant to be free. And if you let it, it will take the last part of you that still resists. So now I ask again. Do you want to see what happened to the first man who resisted? His name was Elias Morvant, one of the 12. But he wasn't like the others. He wasn't born into obedience, he chose it, violently. A former soldier turned theologian. A man broken by war, reshaped by doctrine. He entered St. Luthan's. Not seeking peace, but absolution. The kind that only complete surrender could offer, and the church welcomed him. Because Elias didn't just obey, he evangelized obedience. He memorized entire liturgies in dead dialects. He fasted for 40 days. He practiced silence so profoundly, they said birds would land on his shoulders mid-prayer. The Vatican called him a living chalice, but inside? Something was wrong. We have fragments of his personal writings, pages buried in the margins. Of psalm books found decades later during the deconsecration of a different chapel hundreds of miles away. In them, Elias describes dreams, not of heaven, not of God, but of machines. Endless halls of gears turning in black soil, altars made of copper and bone, and voices not screaming but whispering instructions, patterns, sequences. He wrote, "It is not a devil I serve, it is a clock." You need to understand how profound that is, because that's what St. Luthan's was. A time lock, a trigger point, a place built not just to open something, but to schedule it, to synchronize it. And Elias was the one who started to see it from the inside. He tried to warn them. On the night of the ritual, he hesitated. Broke cadence for exactly 3 seconds. According to second-hand reports from the only living witness, a mute groundskeeper found years later in a Benedictine hospice, Elias turned away from the altar and screamed, "They are binding God to the gear." That was the moment the lights went out. That was the moment they vanished. But here's where it gets worse. Elias was seen again, 15 years later. In Argentina, a remote mission. A priest arrived claiming to be a survivor of a sacrament inverted. He wore robes with no cross. He preached without scripture. His sermons were described as rhythmic, machine-like. And the villagers? They didn't reject him. They followed him. Until every man, woman, and child was gone. When missionaries arrived, the church was empty. No blood, no signs of struggle. Only a single phrase carved into the altar. The clock has found its choir. Do you see it now? This isn't about one place, one man, one time. This is about the program completing itself. You feel it already, don't you? That tremor beneath your thoughts. That chill crawling down your spine, not from fear, but from recognition. Because somewhere deep inside, a part of you always knew that the choices weren't really yours, that the prayers were written long before your birth, that the walls around you weren't just built from brick and duty, but from sequence, from inherited ritual, from invisible constraints mistaken for identity. That's the final stage of the program. Integration.sd. Luthan's wasn't about creating a cult. It was about seeding an operating system. Think of your life as a cathedral. At the center stands the altar, what you worship, your job, your reputation, your relationships. And around it are walls made of decisions, windows made of rules, doors locked by fear. You never built this place. You were placed in it. Conditioned, baptized into obedience, told that if you deviated, even slightly, you were heretic, broken, lost. And every time you doubted, 1,000 quiet voices echoed in your mind. Be good. Be silent. Stay small. Where do you think that came from? St. Luthan's priests are gone. Yes, but their ritual. It runs in millions. Now, teachers, therapists, politicians, influencers, coaches, all repeating the cadence, all channeling the same pulse. And they don't need to know the ritual to serve it, because it's no longer passed down by scroll or scripture. It's embedded in behavior, and once it's embedded, it spreads like faith, like fire with no flame. You've met these people, you've felt their weight. You speak a dangerous idea, and they flinch not from offense, but from program breakage. You disrupt the rhythm they've been trained to protect, and they react with rage or silence, not because you're wrong, because you're unfamiliar. That's the mark of the ritual's success. It made familiarity sacred, pattern holy. Difference unholy.sd. Luthan's wasn't a chapel. It was a black box experiment in thought reform. A model. A pattern so effective, it didn't just spread it, self-replicated. And now it's inside you. In how you doubt yourself. In how you shrink around authority. In the invisible ceiling you feel when you speak the truth too clearly. But here's the twist they never prepared for. Patterns can be broken. Code can be rewritten. They never planned for this part. They engineered obedience. They mastered conformity. They shaped institutions and encoded fear into ritual, silence, and song. But they never prepared for a man who wakes up inside the ritual. A man who sees the altar not as sacred, but as circuitry. A man who recognizes that every kneel, every prayer, every moment of stillness was never meant to elevate the soul, but to bind it. You're that man now. You wouldn't still be here if you weren't. So listen carefully. To break the altar, you don't destroy the institution. You dismantle the parts of you that still obey it, because every cathedral of control is built on internal obedience. External power is meaningless unless it has a servant inside your mind. That servant is the voice that questions your instinct, that doubts your anger, that tells you to smile when you should roar. That voice is not yours. It was installed. And now, we're going to uninstall it. Start here. Reverse the rituals. They taught you silence is virtue. So speak. They taught you stillness is strength. So move. They taught you reverence to title. So question every rank. They taught you to confess to authorities. So confess to no one, except yourself. Do you know what happens when a man reclaims his inner altar? When he tears down the icon that tells him to kneel and replaces it with his own name. The system breaks. Not globally. Not all at once, but in the mirror. And once you take your name back from the structure, the ritual can no longer process you. You're no longer a data point. You're no longer a node. You're unreadable. That's why they fear the awakened. Because we are not violent. We are not loud. We are unavailable to control. They can't categorize us, can't target us, can't use their ancient scripts on us, because we're not following. A script. We're writing our own. And that, right there, is what St. Luthans could never foresee. That one day, the very ritual they built would awaken the antibodies, men who walk through the fourth door not to obey, but to burn the cathedral from within. And if you're ready to become one of them, this is where dissent becomes ascent, but not the kind sold in sermons, not the promise of heaven, not some pearly gate fantasy. No, this is the ascent through fire, through confrontation, through standing before the altar of your own programming and declaring, no more. Because that's the final truth of St. Luthans. It never needed walls. It needed agreement. Every cathedral they ever built, every ritual they ever spread, every psychological chain ever fastened to your instincts, it all depends on one unspoken contract, that you will continue to consent, even in silence, even in fear, even in stillness. But when you withdraw consent, something ancient and terrifying happens. You become sovereign, not politically. Existentially, you cease to be a subject. You become origin, and origin terrifies systems built on obedience. You, in that moment, become something they cannot contain. A man who sees, because to see the ritual is to begin rewriting it. They train generations to fear blasphemy, to equate questioning with punishment. But what they feared wasn't sin, it was sovereignty. You've been taught that humility is holy, that pride is the original sin. But pride is only toxic when it's false. True pride, the recognition of your divine spark, your authority, your capacity to author your own law. That kind of pride shatters altars built by weaker men. They used men like Elias Morvant to bind the ritual. But now, it is men like you who will unbind it. And let me be clear, you don't need permission. You don't need a new priest, a new doctrine, a new system. You need stillness, but not the stillness of obedience. You need the stillness of clarity. That unshakable, roaring calm at the center of awakened identity. That's how the altar burns. Not in flames, but in irrelevance. When a man no longer kneels, the throne becomes a chair. The robe becomes a costume. The ritual becomes a joke. And the system collapses not by force, but by abandonment. This is the war they never expected. A war not of bullets, but of belief. You are no longer inside the ritual. You are beyond it. You want to know what the world looks like when the seminary falls? It looks like men standing, not protesting, not pleading. Just standing without shame, without permission, without apology. Because when the ritual breaks, it doesn't explode. It starves. The cathedral collapses in slow silence. The pulpit echoes with irrelevance. And the high priest speaks into a room where no one's listening. That is how power ends, not in fire, but in absence. They built systems that fed on your loyalty, that harvested your silence, your guilt, your need to belong. And the moment you reclaim those, the system begins to wither. Not instantly, but completely. When the seminary falls, fathers stop preaching doctrine they never wrote. Sons stop measuring their worth by the weight of shame. Men stop offering their instincts on the altar of approval. And something ancient returns. A fire that lived in pre-cathedral men. The kind who walked the earth before obedience became a virtue, before reverence became a chain, before belief was weaponized into control. That fire, it's in you. You feel it now. Not rage, not rebellion. Clarity, the kind of clarity that makes a man look at everything he's inherited, every ritual, every rule, every silent agreement, and say, I choose again. That's the real Forbiddens Act. Not blasphemy, redefinition. You are not your programming. You are not your indoctrination. You are not the echo of 12 vanished priests. You are origin code. A source. A generator. And they've spent centuries trying to make you forget that. Why? Because one sovereign man breaks the algorithm. 2 rewrite it. And 3 become a counter-ritual. A new seminary is forming, not in buildings, but in awareness. In whispered conversations. In silent rooms where men were who they were before the hymn. Before the kneel. Before the collar tightened around the soul. They'll call it heresy, rebellion, sin. Let them, because the names don't matter anymore. Only the action does. And the action now is simple: stand, breathe, remember, then burn the altar. That lives inside your silence. We're not done yet. The ritual hunts in silence, not through shadows, but through systems. It doesn't knock, it integrates. It doesn't scream, it whispers. You'll hear it in boardrooms, in classrooms, in therapy sessions that ask you to dissect your masculinity, but not your captivity. You'll hear it in bureaucracies that claim to heal while feeding you protocols wrapped in sterile compassion. The new priesthood wears smiles. Its altars are screens. Its sacraments are compliance forms. And its sermons? For your safety. That's the most dangerous phrase of all. Because the ritual never announces itself. It always arrives clothed in virtue, wrapped in concern, laced with responsibility. And in doing so, it triggers the deepest program installed by institutions like St. Luthan's. Guilt. Guilt for asking. Guilt for doubting. Guilt for standing. You want to know why the 12 disappeared? Because they saw it first. And once you see the true face of the system, the design behind the devotion, you can never return to who you were. You are marked, not with fire, not with stigma, but with sight. And sight is dangerous. It spreads, which is why the system doesn't just want your obedience. It wants your isolation. It wants to convince you that awakening makes you mad. That clarity is arrogance. That sovereignty is trauma. And in that moment of doubt, it offers you the comfort of returning to the fold, back into the ritual, back into the fourth door. But we don't go back, because now, we're not just standing, we're reaching for the others. The men still asleep. In churches of policy, of culture, of mental health that never touches the soul. The men drowning in guilt they never earned. The sons praying to gods who never answer. The fathers begging for forgiveness from systems designed to keep them broken. We reach for them with fire, not sermons, with presence, not platitudes. We don't ask them to believe. We ask them to remember what it felt like to be whole, what it meant to trust their instinct before it was silenced, what it meant to walk without chains. And when they see us, not preaching, not begging, but walking through the ruins with calm in our eyes, they'll follow, and the ritual will tremble, because what began at St. Luthan's in 1852, endings don't come with explosions. Not for rituals this old. They unravel, quietly, like a bell, that rings once and echoes through centuries, until finally a man hears it for what it is, not a call to worship, but a command to forget. That's what the bell at St. Luthan's was for. It rang 12 times that night, not for the hour. For the offering. Each toll was a code, a pattern, a binding. And now, more than a century later, those echoes still reach. You in the cadence of laws, in the phrasing of promises, in the design of every system that asks you to be a good man, without ever defining what good is, because they define it, and you obey. That was always the real ritual, not religion, not theology, obedience without clarity. But that ends here, not just with knowing, but with remembering that before the doctrine, before the seminary, before the collar, you were something wild, something untrained, something sovereign. They didn't erase that. They buried it, under guilt, under conformity, under centuries of truth delivered by men trained in cathedrals of control. And now you dig with every instinct you reclaim, every boundary you reestablish, every time you look a false authority in the eye and say, no. This is what frightens them most, a man who no longer looks for permission to live, a man who has burned the inner altar and built no new one, a Man who walks without clergy, without algorithm, without applause, because he is no longer processing a ritual. He is transmitting a signal, not a doctrine, but a vibration. A frequency that tells other men, you are not broken, you were bound, and the chains were sacred only because they told you they were. Now, every step you take leaves a crack in the foundation. Every breath you draw in full awareness weakens the structure. You don't need to fight the ritual. You need only to no longer feed it. To withhold your obedience. Your silence, your guilt, and to live not as a priest, or a rebel, or a follower, but as what you were before the system ever spoke your name, a man untamed. You've heard their version of light your entire life. The sterile institutional glow of sanctioned virtue. The fluorescent buzz of controlled sanctity. Be a light in the darkness, they said, but only if that light came from their altar, their books, their approved flame. But that was never light. That was surveillance. That was calibration. That was obedience glowing in sheep's clothing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the light they never wanted you to find. The one that burns instead of comforts. The one that reveals instead of reassures. The kind of light that doesn't come from above, but from within. From the part of you that predates their systems, their sermons, their sanctuaries. The part that remembers deep in the marrow that you were never meant to be governed, only to govern yourself. That's the light that tears veils. It's not kind. It's not polite. It doesn't ask permission. It scorches. It exposes, and it liberates. They feared this light more than any demon, because it does what no rebellion can. It renders their systems irrelevant. You don't destroy their cathedrals. You outgrow them. You don't argue with their priests. You see through them. You don't debate their rituals. You turn your back and walk. And that's uncontainable. That's why the ritual needed 12 men trained from birth to never question, to anchor the schema so deep it would echo through every cathedral built after. St. Luthan's was meant to be the perfect light filter. A structure so precise in its silence, so exact in its guilt, that no man would ever find the flame inside again. But they were wrong, because here you are. You've felt the burn. You've seen the pattern. You've heard the hum beneath the hymn, and you know now that the true altar isn't in a church. It's in the moment a man chooses himself over the system. That choice is sacred. That choice is war. Because from that choice, new architecture begins, not built from stone and silence, but from sovereignty and sound. From the primal roar of a man who will no longer be processed, no longer be formatted, no longer be named by any hand but his own. Say it with me no more. Not whispered, not wept, not begged. Declared. Because words are not just sounds, they're architecture. And the ritual knew this. That's why it began with a sermon and ended with silence. Because silence is not peace when it's enforced, it's erasure. And when a man no longer speaks his own name, when he only speaks what he's told, he becomes property. That's what St. Luthan's was truly training. Men who would erase themselves in service of the system. Men who would say, I am nothing, and call it humility. Who would say, I am broken, and call it faith. Who would kneel, not out of reverence, but out of program. But now you say it. No more. Not to be dramatic, but to be final. Because this is the moment the ritual breaks, not with destruction, but with the reintroduction of origin. You are the origin. You're not a believer. You're not a heretic. You're not a rebel. Those are all positions within the system. And the system needs you in one of them, because that means it still defines the frame. But when you step outside the frame, when you stop asking which part of the ritual you are, you become something else entirely. A man who speaks new words. Not the chants of the seminary. Not the scripts of the state. Not the slogans of the algorithm, but your own. Because new words carry new frequencies, and frequency is function. When you speak from the core, the structure cannot hold you. The echo loses grip. The system, confused, tries to recalibrate. But it can't, because you've exited the pattern. That's the real exorcism. Not casting something out of you. Casting yourself out of the ritual that once held your soul. When Elias Morvant broke cadence in the ritual, they said he failed. They lied. He was the first fractured dot, and now you are the next. A rupture in the quiet. A roar in the cathedral. A man, standing, speaking, walking outside the walls. Once the ritual breaks, the system fights back, not with bullets, not with blades, but with diagnosis. With redirection, with reframing. You will not be hunted as a heretic. That was the old world. In the new world, you will be labeled unstable, unwell, antisocial, radical. Not because you are a danger to others, but because you are a danger to the structure. They will tell you freedom is a delusion, that obedience is safety, that belonging only comes after surrender. But what they really mean is this: your clarity threatens their algorithm, because when a man walks outside the pattern, when he sees the mechanism behind every ritual, when he recognizes how beliefs were installed like software, and how guilt was the security system around his soul, he becomes unpredictable. He becomes unprogrammable. That is the true enemy of the control grid, and they'll try to reclaim you. You'll hear it from every angle. Don't be so extreme. We all need structure. You're just angry. You need help. But you've seen what they call help. You've walked the corridors of compliance they label healing. You've heard the professionals explain away your resistance as trauma, as projection, as fear. But you know the truth. Your symptoms only began after you stopped kneeling. That's not illness, that's birth. You are being reborn outside the doctrine, and the system has no blueprint for that. You'll feel alone. That's part of the test. The ritual was designed to isolate nonconformity, to make questioning feel like madness. But it isn't it's memory. You're remembering who you were before the seminary, before the script, before the fourth door opened inside your chest and whispered, "You are nothing without us." But now you know you are everything they cannot control. That's why they need you quiet, small, discredited. But that time is over. You walk now with no need for ritual. No need for intermediaries. No need for permission. You are the altar. You are the fire. They will come for your fire with smiles, not swords. They won't burn your books. They'll bury them beneath a flood of noise. They won't chain your body. They'll seduce your mind. And the tools they'll use won't look like weapons. They'll look like comfort, entertainment, consensus, agreement, and above all, approval. Because here's the truth no one dares speak aloud. The system doesn't fear your rebellion. It fears your indifference. It fears the man who no longer needs it. That's why they teach you to crave validation, to chase metrics, to need witness. Because a man who speaks only when heard can be silenced. A man who only burns when praised can be doused. But the fire we lit, it doesn't seek applause. It seeks truth. And truth is lonely. You'll walk roads without followers. Speak words few understand. People you love will call you cold, detached, arrogant. Not because you are, but because you no longer dance to the same drum. They'll say you changed. You did. Remembered. And memory is dangerous in a world built on amnesia. The ritual depends on you forgetting who you were. Forgetting the moments you knew something was wrong. Forgetting the chill in your chest when the ritual demanded silence and your soul screamed. So protect the fire, not with violence, with discipline. Guard your mind like sacred ground. Filter every input. Ask, does this feed the ritual or break it? Guard your language. Does it express your truth or their programming? Guard your time. Does it build your altar or rebuild theirs? Every moment is a ritual. Every word a spell. Every action a vote for the world that will exist tomorrow. And you are no longer casting your vote in the cathedral of control. You are building your own temple, one thought, one breath, one rejection at a time. This is how they lose. Not with war, but with withdrawal. When the men they train to be servants stop showing up. When the altars stand empty, when the rituals echo unanswered in empty halls. That's how the fourth door closes. For good, the fourth door is not made of stone or wood. It's made of acceptance. It opens every time a man surrenders his inner voice for the sake of order, of tradition, of belonging to something that demands his submission in exchange for identity. That's the true threshold. And if we're going to seal it forever, we must not just resist it. We must replace it, because nature abhors a vacuum. And the human soul does too. If you destroy the altar and leave nothing in its place, the system will find a way to build another disguised, quieter, even more seductive. The algorithm, the brand, the cause, the tribe. 1,000 new robes, all sewn from the same old thread. So hear me now. If you want to protect yourself, your brothers, your bloodline from ever returning to the ritual, you must build a new architecture, one not based on control, but on remembrance. Because when a man remembers who he is before conditioning, before obedience, before apology, the fourth door cannot open. Not because he fears it, but because he sees it for what it is. Mirror painted black dot, and he walks past it. You start with truth. Not universal truth, not handed down dogma, your truth. The raw, uncut knowing in your gut when you speak what no one else dares. That truth becomes your altar. Then you build discipline, not as punishment, but as devotion. Not to some sky god or phantom morality, but to your own sovereignty. Your word becomes law. Your integrity becomes sacred. And no voice, no clergy, no teacher, no stranger on a screen gets to override what you know. Then, you teach. Not with sermons, with presence, with clarity. With stillness, not the stillness of submission, but the stillness of strength. The kind that makes others ask not, who do you follow? But how did you break free? And when they ask, you don't preach. You point to the ruins behind you, the cathedral you walked out of. The ritual you stopped feeding, and the man you became when you stood alone and remembered your fire. That's how we close the door. By refusing to step back through it. By refusing to kneel ever again. Legacy is not inheritance. It is pattern. It is what survives your death, not in bank accounts or buildings, but in behavior. In the echo of your choices, your discipline, your presence. That's why the architects of the ritual targeted men. Because they knew if they could rewrite your pattern, they could shape generations. They didn't just want you to obey, that they wanted your sons to obey. That's what St. Luthan's was truly about. The 12 weren't just sacrifices, they were seed code. Their disappearance wasn't the end of a ritual, it was the beginning of a transmission. A behavioral virus passed from man to man, father to son, mentor to student. Not through genes. Through example, obedience taught in silence, self-doubt modeled as humility, emotional castration passed off as righteousness. You've seen it. The father who never raised his voice but also never raised his truth. The teacher who told you to think for yourself, then punished you for doing so. The elder who gave you rules but never revealed the system behind them. They weren't evil, they were echoes. But you are not an echo. You are the break in the pattern. And that break becomes your legacy. Your presence will shape more than your words ever can. When a boy sees a man who doesn't flinch in silence, who doesn't seek validation from the pulpit or the feed, who honors his inner compass above all systems, he learns without being taught. That freedom is felt, not explained. That sovereignty is modeled, not mandated. That legacy is not in passing down doctrines. It is in passing down clarity. Your clarity. When you walk into a room and do not shrink, when you speak without performance, when you choose the difficult truth over the comfortable lie, that becomes the new ritual. Not for control, but for remembrance. That's how we kill the echo, not by screaming into the halls of the old cathedrals, but by never rebuilding them. By becoming the kind of man no ritual can process, no system can frame, no god of hierarchy can bend. That is the legacy that ends the fourth door, forever. This is where most men fall, not in fire, but in comfort. Not from assault, but from an invitation. Because the ritual doesn't just punish defiance, it rewards. Return, and when it sees you standing unshaken, unprocessed, unreachable, it won't fight. It will seduce. It will offer you a role, a title, a platform. It will say, "You were right all along. Come back and lead." But the moment you return to lead within the system, you are no longer free. You are a manager of the cage. That's the final test. They'll call you a reformer, a prophet. They'll say, "Change it from the inside." But you can't change a ritual by standing at its altar. You burn it by walking away. By refusing its terms. By denying the premise that control can be repurposed into freedom. You'll feel the pull. It'll come wrapped in praise, in support, in the warmth of belonging. But that warmth is the same frequency that once put chains on your tongue, the same rhythm that erased the 12, the same smile that built the fourth door. And make no mistake, the ritual loves reformers. It loves rebels who circle back, because nothing strengthens a system more than the man who resists, and then returns to heal it. But we don't heal cathedrals. We leave them. We build wild temples in minds, in relationships, in tribes that have no priest, no platform, no programmed language, only clarity. That's your final stand. To say no, not just to the pain of the ritual, but to its promises. To decline the invitation to become its next voice. To abandon the temptation to sit on the throne you once escaped, because that throne doesn't make you a leader. It makes you a liar with better lighting, and the world doesn't need more leaders. It needs more men who cannot be led. Living beyond the ritual isn't peaceful. It's clear. Peace can be sold, fabricated, negotiated. But clarity is earned in fire. And once you have it, the world feels different. Not softer, sharper, cleaner. You walk through systems you once served and see them for what they are. Machines. Efficient. Hollow. Still hungry. You'll be surrounded by people still inside the program. They'll speak in scripts, move in loops, smile when they should scream, and you'll want to reach them, shake them, save them. But you can't. Not with words, only with presence. Because presence is proof of survival, of rejection, of refusal. And when a man who's truly broken the ritual walks among the obedient, something shifts. The air thickens, the rhythm breaks. The programmed feel the glitch, and they either run or awaken. You're not here to awaken everyone. You're here to walk as proof that it can be done. That a man can live without a script. That he can say no to every altar, political, religious, cultural, and still stand, still breathe, still burn. That's the aftermath. Not exile. Sovereignty. And you'll find others. Not crowds, not congregations, but brothers also silent, also marked, also walking. Some will find you because of this message. Some already have. You'll recognize them by the calm, by the absence of apology in their eyes, by the way they speak without reaching, by the way they never try to fix you, convert you, or own you. That's the new order, not a new system. A lack of system. Connection without cage. Bond without brand. Alignment without ritual. It's rare. It's quiet, but it's real. And it's growing. Because every man who leaves the cathedral makes space for one more to see the sky. That's the new transmission. That's what began the moment you stepped through the fourth door and did not disappear. Lived, you remembered, before the ritual, before the doctrine, before the altar and the silence and the chains dressed as blessings. There was only you, not the version they sculpted, not the son they conditioned, not the man molded by echo and approval. The original, the one who knew, without being told, what was sacred. The one who didn't need sermons to feel the divine, because the divine was embedded in his instincts. You've forgotten him. We all have. That's what the ritual was built to do, to bury that first self beneath layers of obedience and shame, to overwrite his voice with verses, decrees, qualifications, shoulds, and musts. But here's the final forbidden truth. He never left. He waited in silence, beneath the programming, beneath the fear, beneath the role-playing and spiritual performance. He waited through every kneel, every nod, every time you betrayed your own sense to keep peace, every time you bit your tongue in front of power. He waited. And when you walked through the fourth door, unlike the 12 who disappeared, you met him, the one they were terrified you'd remember, the one who can't be tamed. He doesn't need scripture, doesn't ask permission, doesn't follow, doesn't lead. He moves, aligned with something older than books, older than language, patternless, but precise. Wild, but grounded. He is the true danger, because he cannot be predicted. He builds nothing for control. He destroys nothing for attention. He simply is. And in his presence, systems dissolve. That's what was buried at St. Luthan's, not just 12 men, but the original pattern of the sovereign. It was never about vanishing them. It was about hiding what they saw. And now that you've seen it, you are no longer within the sequence. You are before it. You are older than the echo, older than the throne, older than the ritual. You are what the ritual was designed to suppress. Here it is, the sentence they fear, the one that was never meant to be spoken, not from pulpits, not in confession, not in seminaries, and certainly not by men who remember. It is not a declaration of war. It is not a creed. It is not a cry. It is a sentence of closure, of severance, of finality. I was never yours. Say it. Not to them. To the pattern.